The most haunted places in the UK and how to investigate them properly. Imagine standing alone in the suffocating darkness of a forgotten crypt, miles beneath a city that buzzes with oblivious life above. The air around you is still, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something indescribable, metallic and ancient. You've brought all your gear, the sensitive EMF meters, the thermal cameras, the carefully calibrated audio recorders. Your goal is simple: to debunk, to rationalize, to prove that every bump and whisper is just a trick of the mind, a draft, a creaking pipe. But what if, in that absolute silence, your EMF meter suddenly flatlines despite being fully charged? What if the thermal camera, designed to detect even the slightest shift in temperature, shows a perfect, uniform blackness, even as the cold seeps into your bones, colder than anything you've ever felt? What if the voice you eventually hear isn't a whisper, but a breath right behind your ear? A breath that carries the scent of something long dead, yet disturbingly present. And what if, after that, every piece of technology you brought with you simply stopped working? Not just a malfunction, but a profound, unrecoverable silence. This isn't just about avoiding fooling yourself. It's about what happens when reality itself begins to fray around the edges, and the darkness you sought to measure starts measuring you. Welcome to the Unveiled Darkness Podcast. I'm your host, and if you're new here, this is the place where we go deep into the stories that don't quite add up, the cases that got buried, the legends that refuse to die, and the darkness that keeps finding its way back to the surface. If that sounds like your kind of night, hit subscribe and make yourself comfortable. We're just getting started. Now, where were we? Tonight, we're journeying to the ancient, shadowed heart of the United Kingdom, a land steeped in history, in blood, and in countless untold horrors that cling to its very stones. From the rolling, mist-shrouded moors of Yorkshire to the subterranean labyrinths beneath Edinburgh, the UK is a patchwork quilt of places where the veil between worlds seems perilously thin. We're not just talking about old houses with creaky floors. We're talking about energy, about imprints, about something that refuses to acknowledge the passage of time. For the serious investigator, these locations present a unique challenge. You arrive with your scientific toolkit, your skepticism sharpened, ready to dissect the supernatural into logical components. But what happens when the logic itself begins to melt away? The question isn't just, are these places haunted, but what happens when you properly investigate them? How do you avoid the pitfall of suggestion, of expectation, of simply wanting to believe? Tonight, we're going to explore what a truly rigorous approach might uncover, and more importantly, what it might fail to explain. Our journey begins in Pluckley, Kent. Officially, it's recognized as the most haunted village in England, a claim bolstered by the Guinness Book of World Records. A picturesque, sleepy place with a handful of ancient pubs, a medieval church, and a quiet stream. At first glance, it feels less like a nexus of spectral activity and more like a postcard from a bygone era. But beneath that placid surface, Pluckley whispers of 17 distinct ghosts. The screaming man, trapped in the brickwork of the old mill. The highwayman, impaled by a sword, still pinned to a tree at Fright Corner. The gypsy woman, burned to death, whose purple smoke sometimes drifts across her grave. A whole legion of the restless. Most paranormal investigations start with an EVP session or an EMF sweep.
You ask questions into the dark, hoping for a response. You look for fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, hoping to detect an energy anomaly. These are standard tools, and they're crucial for documenting tangible evidence. But the true investigator understands the limitations. A faulty wire can spike an EMF reader. A branch scratching against a window can be mistaken for a whisper. The mind, yearning for the unknown, is a master of self-deception. So, when you enter Pluckley, you bring a different kind of rigor. You bring controlled conditions. You bring multiple witnesses, ideally a mix of believers and skeptics. You bring baseline readings, taken before anything happens. You log every anomaly, no matter how small, and search for a rational explanation first. This is where the story of a man named Alistair Thorne becomes unsettling. Thorne was a meticulous, almost obsessively rational investigator. He saw himself as a ghost debunker. He arrived in Pluckley over a decade ago, armed with a grant, a small team, and a relentless dedication to scientific method. He wanted to strip away the folklore and expose the mundane truth. He stayed for weeks, then months. His early reports were exactly what you'd expect: drafts, mice, local teens playing pranks. He recorded nothing truly anomalous. But then, his entries began to change. Thorne began to note things that defied easy explanation, even for his hyper-rational mind. Not grand, dramatic apparitions, but subtle shifts, almost imperceptible. This is the first principle of true investigation. Pay attention to the persistent, small impossibilities. He described a localized chill in the Church of St. Nicholas. Not a general coldness, but a pocket of frigid air that his thermal imaging couldn't explain. It would hover, distinct from the ambient temperature, like an invisible block of ice. And it wasn't always in the same spot. It moved. His team, initially dismissive, started to record similar pockets of cold, completely independent of drafts or external factors. They'd bring in specialized equipment, set up temperature grids, and still these cold spots would appear, linger, and dissipate without a trace. No logical heat transfer, no explanation. This wasn't a draft. This was a void. One evening, while performing an EVP session in the churchyard, Thorne recorded a distinct, almost guttural sigh. His team confirmed it. No one had been near the microphone. They played it back, isolated the sound, ran it through filters. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't wind. It was breath. A deep, weary sound. But the truly disturbing detail came from the infamous fright corner. Thorne had set up motion sensors and tripwires, an infrared camera, hoping to catch the highwayman. He logged weeks of nothing but local wildlife. Then, one night, the sensors were tripped. The infrared camera recorded a momentary, almost translucent distortion in the air, a ripple like heat haze, but at night, in the cold. It was gone in an instant. No figure, no physical form, just that peculiar, shimmering disturbance. The tripwire remained undisturbed. It was as if something had passed through the space, not over it. This is the point where the urban legends start to collide with the scientific method. When your instruments, designed to measure the quantifiable, start registering the utterly unquantifiable. Thorne in his journal started to write not about anomalies, but impressions. He felt watched in the church. He felt a profound, heavy sadness in the mill. This is where the rules of investigation shift. You've recorded the data, you've debunked the easy explanations. Now you're left with something that exists outside the comfortable confines of science. And that's when the real haunting begins.
Alistair Thorne moved his focus from Pluckley to the ancient lands surrounding Pendle Hill in Lancashire, a place steeped in darker history, home to the infamous Pendle witches, hanged in 1612. Here, the landscape itself feels ancient and scarred, the peat bogs and twisted trees seeming to hold echoes of persecution and fear. Thorne's approach here was even more rigorous. He studied historical documents, cross-referencing witness accounts from the witch trials with the geography of the land. His initial hypothesis was simple: mass hysteria, fueled by poverty and religious extremism. The hauntings would be psychological imprints, residual energy from intense suffering. He deployed magnetometers, sensitive enough to detect minute geological shifts, hoping to find natural magnetic anomalies that might influence perception. He set up infrasound detectors, looking for low-frequency vibrations known to cause feelings of anxiety and dread. He was determined to find the rational kernel within the legend. And he found some. Certain areas of the hill did indeed have unusual magnetic fluctuations and occasional infrasound spikes. These could certainly contribute to the feeling of unease. He documented them meticulously. This is the mark of a good investigator, not denying the experience, but seeking its source. But then Thorne's notes started to describe something else, a profound sense of presence that began to manifest, not as a visual or auditory hallucination, but as a direct, invasive sensation. He reported feeling a pressure, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest in specific areas of the hill, especially near Malkin Tower, the supposed meeting place of the witches. It wasn't just him. Members of his new team, screened for suggestibility, began reporting similar feelings. One recounted a sensation of hands pressing down on her shoulders, even when no one was near. Another described a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, a primal fear that had no source in their surroundings. This is where the ghost hunting paradigm truly fractures. How do you measure a feeling? How do you document an invasive sensation of dread? Thorne started to incorporate subjective scales into his data collection, asking his team to rate their emotional state, their physical sensations in specific locations. He was attempting to quantify the unquantifiable. His analysis began to reveal patterns. The sense of pressure, the localized cold, the profound sadness, they weren't random. They were strongest in areas associated with the most intense suffering during the witch trials. It was as if the land itself remembered. Here's what we know so far. Alistair Thorne, a committed skeptic, began his investigations seeking to rationalize the supernatural. He found predictable phenomena in Pluckley that defied easy debunking, localized, unexplained cold spots, and a profound, wordless sigh. At Pendle Hill, he meticulously documented physical sensations, pressure, invasive dread that seemed to correlate with areas of historical trauma. He was moving from measuring external phenomena to documenting internal, yet shared experiences. And this shift, this acknowledgement of the deeply subjective as potentially objective, was his most dangerous discovery. Thorne's research led him further north, to Edinburgh, Scotland, specifically to the legendary Edinburgh Vaults. These subterranean chambers, nestled beneath the bustling South Bridge, were built in the late 18th century. Initially storage and workshops, they quickly became a haven for the city's poorest, for criminals, for the diseased and dying. A place of squalor, despair, and forgotten horrors.
The very air down here seemed to carry the weight of centuries of suffering. A cold, damp breath on the skin, a pervasive scent of stale earth and hidden decay that clung to one's clothes and hair. This environment provided Thorne with a new challenge. The vaults are inherently unsettling. The air is heavy, often damp, and the natural acoustics can play tricks on the ear. Perfect conditions for self-deception. Thorne knew this. He brought in environmental sensors for everything: air pressure, humidity, light levels, sound. He wanted to isolate any ambient factors that could contribute to the overwhelming feeling of dread many visitors reported. The silence here wasn't empty. It felt loaded, a constant hum just beneath the threshold of hearing, as if the stones themselves were groaning under immense unseen pressure. His initial findings confirmed much of what he expected. The low-frequency rumble of traffic above, the natural echoes, the poor ventilation, all contributed to a general sense of unease. He could explain away the distant scraping sounds as geological shifts, or the feeling of breath on one's neck as air currents. The chill that seeped into bones was simply the natural lack of sunlight, the persistent damp. But then, his equipment began to fail in peculiar ways. Not a general breakdown, but selective, localized failure. In one particular chamber, known as the Haunted Vault, his carefully calibrated thermometer would drop dramatically and instantaneously by several degrees, and then, moments later, return to ambient temperature. The drop wasn't just a reading, it was a physical sensation, a sudden, inexplicable chill that bit deep, prickling the skin even through layers of clothing. The issue wasn't the thermometer. Multiple devices from different manufacturers did the exact same thing in that exact spot. He brought in a thermal camera, and this is where things became truly disturbing. Instead of a cold spot, the camera would sometimes pick up an area of absolute zero thermal signature. Not just cold, but a complete absence of heat, an anomaly that defied the laws of physics. It was a patch of utter thermal darkness, like a hole ripped in reality, absorbing warmth and light, leaving a vacuum. And it would appear and disappear without warning, its edges indistinct, flickering at the very edge of perception. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't a trick of the mind. This was a physical impossibility recorded by multiple scientific instruments. Thorne, the unwavering rationalist, found himself staring at data that simply shouldn't exist, his carefully constructed worldview beginning to fracture under the weight of the impossible. His journal entries became terse, almost frantic. He wrote about the silence in the vaults, how it wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a hungry silence, a silence that seemed to swallow sound and personal thought, leaving only the echo of fear. He began to sleep poorly, haunted by the memory of the thermal voids, the chilling sensation they left in their wake,
and a growing gnawing sense of being watched from the oppressive shadows. One evening, conducting an overnight vigil in the haunted vault, Thorne and his assistant experienced something that would forever shatter their scientific detachment. They were alone, all external factors controlled, their equipment meticulously laid out in the oppressive gloom, every nerve strained in anticipation. His assistant, Sarah, was monitoring an audio recorder. Thorne was observing the thermal camera. The thermometer had just registered another impossible drop, a profound, icy gasp in the chamber. And then the air grew thick, heavy, as if the very oxygen was being pulled from the room, leaving a vacuum that pressed against the lungs.
A tangible pressure began to build, pressing against their chests, their eardrums, a slow, internal crushing. Sarah gasped. The audio recorder, which had been silent, picked up a single, guttural cough. It wasn't human. It was too deep, too wet, too ancient. A sound dredged from a long-forgotten throat, accompanied by a sickening, fleshy squelch. And then a low, rasping whisper, too distorted to understand, but clearly articulating malice, a dry, papery hiss that seemed to scrape against their very bones. Sarah dropped the recorder, her face ashen, eyes wide with incomprehension and dawning horror. Thorne stared at the thermal camera. The zero thermal void wasn't just appearing and disappearing anymore. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, and with an undeniable malevolent purpose. It was moving towards them, a widening patch of absolute thermal death. The air in the haunted vault became suffocating, each breath a struggle against an invisible weight. That thermal void, that patch of absolute cold and darkness, drifted closer. It was shapeless, yet felt impossibly dense, like a hole torn in the fabric of existence, drawing all warmth, all light, all life into its impossible depths. Thorne, for the first time in his career, felt true, paralyzing terror, a primal fear that erased logic. His scientific curiosity was annihilated by something far more primal. Sarah was whimpering, pressing herself against the damp stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Thorne, frozen, his muscles rigid with dread, could only watch as the thermal anomaly continued its slow, inexorable approach. It wasn't moving like a gas or a draft. It advanced with a deliberate, creeping purpose, a silent predator claiming its territory. And then, as it drew within mere feet of them, their headlamps began to flicker erratically, spitting dying sparks of light. The carefully placed light sticks, designed to provide ambient illumination, dimmed and died one by one with soft, sickening pops, plunging the vault into near total darkness, broken only by the feeble, sputtering glow of Thorne's headlamp, which seemed to be losing its fight. In that sudden, engulfing gloom, the silence returned. But it wasn't the hungry silence Thorne had noted before. This was a presence, palpable and immense, a weight that pressed down on their very souls, a suffocating blanket of malevolence. It was pure, unalterated evil, not just ambient, but directed, focused, observing them with an ancient, patient hatred. Then Sarah let out a strangled cry, a sound torn from deep within her. Thorne spun, his fading headlamp beam darting wildly through the encroaching blackness. He caught a glimpse of her, cowering, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended any ghost story, a raw, violated terror. It touched me, she whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking with revulsion. Not a cold spot, not a pressure. It was a finger, like something dry and skeletal, on my cheek. So cold, so dry. Thorne, despite his terror, tried to rationalize. A draft, a spider. But Sarah's reaction, the sheer, visceral terror, was too real, too absolute. And then he felt it too. Not a touch, not a pressure, but a sound, a single, distinct clack, like a bone against stone, a hard, dry articulation in the absolute void. It seemed to come from directly in front of him, from within the thermal darkness itself. A tiny, insignificant sound, yet in that crushing darkness, it was the loudest, most terrifying thing he had ever heard. It implied a physicality, a bone-deep structure, that defied all his readings, all his understanding of a mere void. He couldn't see anything. His headlamp sputtered again, then died. Total darkness. The overwhelming cold, now gnawing at his very core. The suffocating pressure that seemed to squeeze the breath from his lungs. And then he heard the rasping breath again, closer this time, almost rhythmic. A slow, wet inhalation and exhalation. In, out, right in front of him. He could almost feel it on his face, a foul, damp current of air. And with that breath came a faint, sickening stench of something ancient, something that had decayed long, long ago in a tomb forgotten by time, yet was still horrifyingly present, clinging to his throat. This was the moment. This was the peak of the horror. Not a jump scare, but a slow, agonizing realization that something ancient, malevolent, and utterly inexplicable was not just there, but was aware of them, had drawn them in, patiently waited, and now it was revealing itself on its own terms, a monstrous intelligence awakened. When rescue teams finally located Thorne and Sarah hours later, they were found huddled together, unresponsive, deep in the haunted vault. Sarah was diagnosed with severe shock and trauma, suffering from nightmares that spoke of grasping skeletal fingers. She never returned to paranormal investigation. She never spoke of what she saw or felt that night in any detail, only that it wasn't a ghost, it was something else. Thorne was physically unharmed, but something had fundamentally broken inside him. He gave up his research grant, abandoned his team, and retreated from public life. His final journal entry, scrawled days after the incident, was chillingly simple. The tools are useless. It doesn't want to be measured. It wants to be known. All the equipment they brought into the haunted vault that night was irrecoverably damaged. Not broken in a physical sense, but simply inert. Batteries dead, circuits fried, software corrupted. Every piece of sensitive electronics they had rendered useless. Thorne believed it wasn't a malfunction, it was an act. A deliberate wiping of their records, a severing of their connection to the measurable world. The thermal voids in the vaults continue to be reported by guides and visitors, though never with the intensity that Thorne's calibrated instruments once recorded. The cold spots in Pluckley persist, the sighs echo, and the pressure on Pendle Hill still settles on the unwary. But what remains is not just the phenomenon itself, but the lingering question of what happens when you approach these places with a genuine desire to understand, to quantify. What if the very act of seeking an explanation, of bringing your rational mind and your measuring devices, isn't an act of control, but an invitation? The UK is dotted with thousands of such places, each one a story, a legend, a whispered dread. From the ghostly apparitions of Glamis Castle, to the menacing shadows of the Tower of London, to the inexplicable disappearances on Dartmoor. Each one an opportunity for the curious, for the brave, for those who believe they can unravel the threads of the supernatural with logic and science. But Thorne's story serves as a stark warning. You can arm yourself with every device, every methodology, every ounce of skepticism. You can promise yourself you won't be fooled. But what if the haunting isn't a mere echo of the past, but an active, intelligent entity capable of manipulating not just your perceptions, but your very reality? Alistair Thorne set out to demystify the most haunted places in the UK. His initial intention was to teach us how to investigate them properly, how to avoid fooling ourselves, how to find the mundane truth behind the legend. And he did teach us. He showed us the importance of controlled environments, baseline readings, multiple perspectives, and rigorous data analysis.
But his ultimate discovery was far more terrifying than any ghost story. He found that even with the most meticulous approach, some things transcend explanation. Some phenomena don't just exist, they respond, they adapt, they learn, and they defy every instrument designed to contain them within the realm of the rational. His experience in the Edinburgh vaults shattered his belief that reality was a quantifiable, explainable construct. He faced something that actively silenced his equipment, that touched his assistant, that breathed on his face. Something that communicated not with words, but with a palpable, malevolent presence. This isn't about the screaming man in Pluckley, or the highwayman at Fright Corner, or the suffering of the Pendle witches. It's about the underlying force, the darkness that seems to cling to these ancient places, using their history as a veil. And it's about what happens when you, armed with your careful methodology, step beyond the veil. Remember that unsettling question from the beginning? What if, in that absolute silence, your EMF meter flatlines, Your thermal camera shows a perfect blackness, and a breath, carrying the scent of something long dead, is right behind your ear. Thorne's journey suggests that this isn't just a hypothetical scenario, it's a possible outcome. It's what happens when you've meticulously removed every rational explanation, and what remains is an impossible, terrifying truth. The lingering question isn't whether these places are haunted, it's whether, by seeking to investigate them, to understand them, we are simply opening ourselves up to an ancient, patient darkness that waits, not to be proven, but to be acknowledged, to be let in. And once you've acknowledged it, once you've let it in, how do you ever truly close the door? That's all for tonight's journey into the Veiled Darkness. If Alistair Thorne's unsettling discoveries have given you pause, or perhaps sparked a morbid curiosity, let me know in the comments below. What do you think truly happened to him, and what's the most inexplicable experience you've ever had in a place steeped in history? If you want to keep exploring the stories that lurk just beyond the edge of explanation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the unknown. Next time, we'll be delving into the chilling phenomenon of shadow people. Are they residual energies, interdimensional beings, or something far more personal and terrifying? Until then, keep your lights on and question everything. But most importantly, question what you can't explain. Good night.